Narayana Samarambam Vyasa Shankaramadhyamam Asmadacharya Paryantam Vande Guru Paramparam. Om Vasudevendra Yogindram Natva Jnana Pradam Gurum Mumukshunam Hitartaya Tattva Bodho Vidiyate. In the last video, we concluded our discussion on the three states by talking about the deep sleep state. And the end of the section of the text that talks about the deep sleep state is actually the end of a larger portion of the text that talks about the not self by describing the three bodies, the five sheaths, and then the three states. Now, after talking about the not self at great length, the text takes up the topic of you, the self. Now, we actually covered this material earlier in the video series, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time with the next portion of this text. If you have questions about it or you'd like to hear some elaboration on this part of the text, then go back and review videos 7, 8, and 9. So now we'll take up this section of the text that is titled The Self. What is the self? It is non-dual consciousness, the unchanging, indivisible, independently existent, eternal, infinite, imperceptible essence of everything, ever free of all action and experience. It is distinct from the gross, subtle, and causal bodies. It is beyond the five sheaths. It is the witness of the three states of experience. It is you. Now, the first part of this statement, what is the self? Non-dual consciousness, unchanging, indivisible, independently existent, eternal, infinite, imperceptible essence of everything, ever free of all action and experience. That's the part of the sentence that's taken up in videos 7, 8, and 9. But I do want to comment on the last three sentences in this paragraph. It is distinct from the gross, subtle, and causal bodies, it meaning you, the self. It is distinct from the gross, subtle, and causal bodies. Now, when we say distinct, it's important to note that this is a metaphor. The word distinct has to be used. The teaching method of Vedanta exists in duality, or in the appearance of duality, and it therefore is limited by duality in itself, meaning that in duality, in order to convey knowledge, we're forced to use words, descriptions, metaphors. So Vedanta does use metaphors that ultimately have limitations, as metaphors tend to do. And that's what I want to talk about here, the limitations of the language used in these three sentences. For instance, the word distinct. We're saying that you, the self, are distinct from the three bodies. Now, that almost implies that there is you, the self, and then these things called the three bodies. As I probably have mentioned before, the description of the not self in this text, starting with the three bodies, is not for the intention of establishing the reality, the actuality of the three bodies. It is for the purposes of objectifying the not self, recognizing the not self as an object, in order to get rid of the belief that objects are real and destroy your identification with objects, meaning the belief that I am an object. Because when we think that we are the body or the mind, we are identifying ourselves with the gross body and the subtle body, for instance. So that's the purpose of talking about these things: 3 bodies, 5 sheaths, 3 states, is to get you to start inquiring into whether or not they are real and to whether or not they are you. So that's what this metaphor, that's the purpose of this metaphor. When we say distinct, the purpose of that is not to ultimately prove that there are 2 different orders of reality, meaning you, the self, and the 3 bodies, which are the not self. Distinct makes it sound like they're 2 separate things. That is what the word distinct means. But again, this is not to be taken literally. It's a metaphor. The point being to get you to start inquiring into whether or not you are an object. As we've said before, if an object is known to you, then it cannot be you. You cannot be the object that you know. That's how we start that inquiry, by saying, hey, you actually are distinct from that object. We're starting to show you how you shouldn't be identified with these objects. There's not any reason how you could actually be that object. So we say you are distinct. That is a temporary description that ultimately we're going to investigate. Because if there's self and not self, and that's an actuality, then we're still left with duality. The duality of self and not self. However, Vedanta says that reality is non-dual. So we're only taking on these descriptions provisionally for a temporary period of time in order to investigate the reality of objects and to dispel the identification with objects. But then after that is done, that is the first step of inquiry. It is a necessary step. Once it's finished, then the distinction between self and not self has to be investigated to see if there is an actual duality, if there's an actual difference, right? Is the not self actually different from the not self? And that is what will be taken up in the next section of the text. But before we get there, I want to apply this same idea here to these other sentences. We've said that distinct is a metaphor used initially to facilitate inquiry. When we say you are distinct from the gross bodies, we're trying to get you to see that those bodies are objects that appear in you. It is beyond the 5 sheaths. Again, we have to use words here, and there are limitations to words. So we're using this word beyond in a temporary, provisional sense in order to facilitate inquiry. Why is that? Because the word beyond implies some kind of spatial reference. It's making it sound like the self is in one place and the 5 sheaths are in another. Okay, the 5 sheaths are over here and then the self is beyond them. But again, this is a temporary description, because in the sentence, the description of the self right before this sentence, it says that you, the self, are infinite. And so if you're infinite, that means that you have no spatial limitations. You're all pervasive. There is nowhere that you are not. So in truth, you can't be beyond anything, because there's nothing other than you to be beyond. But again, initially, at first, we need to investigate this idea of whether or not we are the 5 sheaths. And It doesn't help to just say there are no 5 sheaths in actuality, because it appears that there are 5 sheaths. That's where we start inquiry. Everyone just takes it at face value that the objects are real and that we are objects. It's just a common belief that applies to everybody. No one thinks, at least initially, to question whether or not they are this apparent person, this combination of body and mind. A Vedanta at first needs to draw your attention to that belief. And in order to do that, it uses language like distinct or beyond to show you how logically you can't be this object that appears in you. And then ultimately, we have to reconcile the difference between the 5 sheaths and the self that is beyond it. Otherwise, we're stuck with duality again. 5 sheaths, self. Okay? Not self, 5 sheaths, and self. And Vedanta is saying that reality is non-dual. So beyond, again, is a temporary description of the self intended to facilitate inquiry. Step 1 of inquiry. And it's the same case when in the last sentence here it says, the self is the witness of the 3 states of experience. The self is commonly referred to as a witness in the scriptures. The Sanskrit term is sakshi or sakshin or sakshi chaitanya. So witness, sakshi chaitanya means witnessing consciousness. Now, initially, this is a very important thing to describe, important way to describe the self, because it starts to show you that you cannot be the objects, but rather you are the consciousness in which the objects appear. You are the consciousness that witnesses the object. But what is the limitation of this metaphor? Well, first of all, it ascribes an action to the self, the action of witnessing. And also, it implies duality, witness and that which is witnessed. And as the texts say, there is no actual duality. There's only the appearance of duality. However, it's helpful at first. You start to talk about the self as a witness, and that helps the inquirer to see that instead of being these objects, you are the consciousness in which these objects appear. And that breaks the belief in objects, in their reality, and that breaks the identification with objects. Now, once that's complete, once you can see, hey, objects aren't real, and I cannot be these objects, then we have to start to investigate the fundamental difference between self and not self. We know that there isn't really a not self. We know that the not self is not actually real. So how can we see that in truth there really is only the self? Not the self plus the not self, because that would be duality. And that is the topic that is going to be covered in the next section of the text, essentially. Outwardly, it looks like the text is talking about creation theories, cosmology, because the next heading of the text, for instance, is called The Creator and the Creation. It's talking about how can there be a creation, meaning the not self. And if there's a creation, what created it? That's what's going to be talked about. So outwardly, this section of the text is an explanation an initial explanation to the inquirer who is experiencing the appearance of duality and still not quite sure how it comes to be, how it works, etc. These are natural questions. You say, well, if there's this not self, this creation, where does it come from? How can there be a not self? What creates this not self? What is the nature of this creator? And more importantly, what is the relationship of me, the individual person, to the creation and the creator? So that is part of what is addressed in this section of the text. Some cosmological, almost theological questions. But the deeper meaning of this explanation is to reconcile self to not self. And the way that this part of the text is doing it is dividing the not self into three categories. We've done the three bodies, we've done the five sheaths, we've done the three states, but now in this section it's going to divide the not self into three general categories. And there is the individual person, the body, mind, entity. There is the world or the creation in which this entity finds itself. And then there is the creator of this world and of the individual. Those are basically the three factors that you'll find in the not self. There isn't anything outside of that. The person, the world, and the creator of the world. And so it's going to describe each one of those factors, the individual, the creator, and the creation, and then reconcile or show the non-difference, the essential non-difference of each one of those things. It's going to show how ultimately the individual and the creation are essentially non-different, how the creation and the individual are essentially non-different from the creator, and how ultimately the individual, creation, and creator are essentially non-different from you, the self, thereby facilitating the knowledge or understanding of the non-dual nature of reality. So that's a good thing to keep in mind as we go through this text, this part of the text, because you can get a little bit sidetracked when we start to talk about the nature of the creation, the nature of the creator, and how these things all work, the particulars of all of these things. It's easy to get stuck on some of the details about how all of this happens, why it happens, etc. It's good to keep in mind that Vedanta, although it talks about the creator and the creation and offers creation theories, its ultimate purpose is not to explain why there is a creation, how there is a creation, what the nature of the creation and the creator is, because from the Vedantic standpoint, the non-dual standpoint, there is no actual creation. There is no actual creator, and there is no actual individual. The reason I want to point this out is because people oftentimes have questions about this. They say, well, why is there an appearance? Why is there a creation? Why is there an individual? And that question is only relevant from the standpoint of ignorance, meaning the standpoint of not understanding the true nature of the self. If you understand what the true nature of the self is, what your true nature is, then you understand that reality is non-dual, and that in truth there is no creator, there is no creation, there is no individual. There is the appearance of one, but even that appearance itself, essentially, at its core, at its nature, is really just you, non-dual existence, consciousness, limitlessness. That's what it actually is. So when that's understood, the question of why is there a creation, why is there the appearance of the creation, all of those things are rendered moot or pointless, because you see that you're asking why and how about something that doesn't actually exist. It's almost like asking, why is there Bugs Bunny? What is the nature of Mickey Mouse? That's not really a valid question, because Bugs Bunny and Mickey Mouse have no reality. They have the appearance of a reality, true, but in essence they have no real reality. You can't ask, where does Bugs Bunny live? What does Bugs Bunny do? All of these kind of things. Where does Mickey Mouse live? What does Mickey Mouse do? Because you're inquiring into an unreal entity, an entity that has no actual substance. And it's the same way with the creation, the creator, and Maya. These things have no actual substance. And when that is seen to be true, when it's seen that truthfully, in reality, there's only you, non-dual, limitless consciousness, all questions about why is there a world, how does the world work, etc., all of those questions go away, because you can see that they were based on the belief that there actually is a world, that there actually is a creator, that there actually is an individual. So that's the context for this next section of the text. The heading is the creator and the creation. The question is, how can there be a creation, a not self, if the self is non-dual, unchanging, and actionless? Now, this is a valid question. The text at this point has gone on at great length about the not self, the not self, the not self, all the while saying that reality is non-dual. So the answer to this question right up front is, how can there be a creation and not self if the self is non-dual? The answer to that question is, well, there is no creation, no actual creation. There's the appearance of one, but that appearance of the creation is really just the self with the appearance of a creation being superimposed on it. Basically, it's all the self, and through ignorance, you're seeing it as something other than the self. In the same way that in the dark, someone sees a rope and thinks that it's a snake. There's no actual snake there. There's really only a rope, but through ignorance, you see something or experience something that's not there. So that's the answer to the question right off the bat. How can there be a not self? Well, there really isn't. There's only the appearance of a not self. However, that explanation right up front will only make sense, or will only satisfy a very small amount of people. So we want to explain this appearance of the not self in terms of the apparent reality, from the perspective of the person experiencing this apparent reality, this appearance of duality. So this is the explanation that Vedanta gives. How can there be a creation? It is owing to Maya, a power that depends on the self for its apparent existence. Now, Maya is a term that you should probably try to remember, because you will come across it quite often in Vedanta. Now, Maya, as it says here in the text, is what Vedanta proposes is the cause of the creation. Now again, this is a provisional, temporary explanation. We're not trying to establish the actuality of Maya. So there's no need to really get hung up on the details of Maya, because ultimately Maya is not real. And the scripture is saying that right here in this verse when it says that Maya is a power that depends on the self for its apparent existence. So when we say that something depends on the self for its apparent existence, then it is what? It is mithya. It too is an object. It is something that cannot exist without borrowing existence from you, the self. This is an important point to make because it's not as if Maya is something that's separate from the self, something that is independent of the self. It has the exact same status of the objects that it creates. The objects that are created are mithya, they are unreal. The Maya that creates the objects is also mithya, unreal. And because of that, Maya ultimately is not explainable. And we've talked about this. Mithya is something that is neither real nor completely unreal. It's not real because it is a transient, ever-changing object that is known to you. So it cannot be considered real. It cannot be considered totally non-existent because something that's totally non-existent cannot be experienced. And the truth is that we do experience objects, we do experience mithya, we do experience Maya, or the effects of Maya, because Maya is what produces the objects. So it's neither totally existent or real, it's neither, and it's not completely non-existent. It's neither real nor non-existent. It falls into a strange category in between, which is unreal. And ultimately, because of that, it cannot totally ever be explained. It's not logical that something can be available, that the status of something that's unreal is not completely explainable. That's why it is categorized as mithya. So it's important to say here that everything that we have talked about regarding objects or mithya at this point applies exactly the same way to Maya. And Maya does not have a different status of the not self. It does not have a different status of objects. You don't experience Maya directly. You experience the effects of Maya, meaning the objects that it creates. Similar to the way that you don't experience the causal body directly, but you do experience the effects of the causal body, meaning the gross body and the subtle body. We mentioned that before when talking about the causal body in relation to the individual. We said that the causal body was the unmanifest cause of the individual subtle body and gross body. You don't experience the causal body directly as an object because it is the cause of the objects. And in the same way, that is how Maya is. When talking about the causal body, said we kind of expound on some points about the causal body when we got to this section on Maya. And one of those points is that Maya is also conceived of as the total causal body. We call Maya the causal body in relation to the individual. The portion of Maya that causes the individual person we refer to as the causal body. But in truth, that individual causal body of that person is really just a part of the total causal body, which we refer to in its totality as Maya. Okay? So where we say that the causal body is the cause of the individual mind and body, we're saying that the totality of causal bodies is Maya, and it is the cause of all minds. It is the cause of all bodies. It is the cause of all objects. It is the cause of the entire creation. So those are the 2 points that we want to think about at this time, which is that how can there be objects? Well, there is this power called Maya. Maya depends on you, the self, for its apparent existence. That means that just like objects, Maya is unreal. Maya is mithya. It has the exact same status as all of the objects that you experience. Maya, although not experienced directly as an object, is the cause of all objects, in the same way that the causal body is the cause of the individual subtle body and the individual gross body. Maya is the cause of all subtle bodies, all gross bodies, and all of the objects that make up the entire creation. In the next video, we will talk a little bit more about Maya, about the energies or the qualities that make up Maya. The Sanskrit word for qualities or energies is guna, and there are 3 gunas: sattva, rajas, and tamas. And how they make up Maya and what exactly they do will be the topic of the next video. Purnamidaf, Purnamidam, Purnat, Purnamadacyate, Purnasya, Purnamadaya, Purnameva Vashishyate. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti.
Bhaja Govindam, Bhaja Govindam.